How did we become what we hate the most unintentionally? Have you ever wondered why certain people, behaviors, or even ideas bother you so much? That irritation that arises like a thorn in your soul, impossible to ignore. But what if I told you that what you hate so intensely might actually be a reflection of what's inside you? That what we despise in others could be a shadow of ourselves, a piece of our own history that we haven't yet faced. It sounds scary, doesn't it? After all, how can we become what we detest the most? But the truth is that we've all been there. At some point, we find ourselves fighting against something outside of us without realizing that the real battleground is right here inside. And this silent struggle might be shaping us in ways we never imagined. Today, we're going to explore what great thinkers like Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, and even the Stoics have to teach us about this relationship between hate and who we are. And more importantly, how we can transform this energy into something powerful, liberating, and even healing. So before we continue, I invite you to reflect. Could what bothers you the most in the world hold a valuable lesson about who you truly are? If the answer is yes, maybe it's time to take a closer look and, who knows, find a new way to handle these emotions. Shall we embark on this journey together? Have you ever stopped to think about why something or someone triggers so much hate in you? It might be an attitude, a personality trait, or even a behavior that no matter how hard you try, you can't ignore. It's almost as if that characteristic is chasing you, no matter how much you try to distance yourself from it. But what if I told you that what you reject in others might somehow be inside you? The truth is that often the hate we feel isn't just about the other person. It can be a reflection, a shadow of what we avoid facing within ourselves. It sounds strange, I know, but Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, taught us something powerful. We project onto others what we can't admit in ourselves. Think for a moment. Could what you despise actually be a part of you, repressed, hidden, waiting to be acknowledged? Imagine someone who hates arrogance. This person criticizes, points fingers, and makes a point of distancing themselves from those who act that way. But in specific situations, they might themselves act arrogantly without even realizing it. It's as if there's an invisible mirror between us and the world. And this mirror reflects not only what we see in others, but also what we insist on not seeing in ourselves. This hate is like a warning sign. It's showing you something that deserves your attention. Something that, if you have the courage to explore, can help you grow. Now ask yourself, could what irritates me the most in others be something I haven't yet accepted in myself? The good news is that this isn't a full stop. On the contrary, it's an invitation to begin a journey of self-awareness, of understanding that what we reject the most can be transformed. Because deep down, the more you know yourself, the more you grow. And the more you grow, the less the outside world controls you. After all, true change starts from the inside out. So are you ready to look in the mirror? But wait, isn't it curious how this invisible mirror works? It doesn't just reflect what we reject. It also reveals something deeper, what we insist on hiding from ourselves. And this is where a fascinating idea from Freud comes in, the psychological projection. Now let's take a step further and understand how this projection shapes what we feel, how it silently acts in our relationships, and more importantly, how we can use it to see who we really are. 1. Freud's psychological projection. Imagine you're carrying a backpack full of feelings, thoughts, and traits that, for some reason, you prefer not to admit. Maybe because they don't align with who you believe you are or who you want to show to the world. What happens to all of this? It doesn't disappear. On the contrary, Freud explains that we project these internal contents onto others. Think about the last time you felt intense irritation towards someone. It might have been an attitude that seemed to provoke you directly, something so annoying it was impossible to ignore. Now reflect. Could what bothered you so much actually be something you also carry within yourself but never wanted to acknowledge. Freud believed that projection is a defense of our unconscious. It happens because it's easier to see in others what we avoid in ourselves. It's like a displaced reflection. You see it, but you don't realize its origin is inside. Hate, in this context, can be a warning cry, pointing to these repressed characteristics. For example, someone who constantly criticizes others' ambition might deep down be repressing their own desire to achieve more. Maybe they've learned that ambition is wrong or selfish, and to avoid internal conflict, they point fingers at others. But the issue isn't about who is outside, it's about who we're trying to hide. This process might seem uncomfortable, but it's also liberating. Identifying these projections gives us the chance to reframe them. After all, what we project onto others doesn't have to define us. On the contrary, by bringing these repressed traits to light, we can integrate them and transform them into something that strengthens us instead of dividing us. So, the next time something or someone triggers a strong emotion, especially hate or contempt, take a pause. Ask yourself, what does this say about me? What can I learn from this reflection? The answer might be the first step toward a more honest connection with yourself. And it's in this courage to face our projections that we begin to make space for a new level of awareness. Speaking of which, can we ignore the parts of ourselves that we reject? This is where Carl Jung enters the conversation with an even deeper view of our shadow. 2. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. Within each of us, there's a part we prefer not to look at. It's like carrying a suitcase left tossed at the bottom of a dark closet, full of characteristics we reject, feelings we deny, and desires we fear to admit. Carl Jung called this part the shadow. The shadow isn't an enemy. In fact, it's composed of everything that doesn't fit into the image we've created of ourselves. These are traits we've learned to suppress because we believe they're not acceptable. Anger, envy, selfishness, fear. But by trying to erase them, we don't eliminate them. On the contrary, they remain hidden in our unconscious, where they gain strength, ready to manifest in ways we can't control. Jung warns us, ignoring the shadow is like walking around with a ticking time bomb. The more you pretend it doesn't exist, the more it grows and starts dictating your actions without you realizing it. Have you ever wondered why sometimes you act in ways that don't even seem like you? Why you blow up in an argument or make decisions that contradict who you believe you are? That could be the shadow speaking. But here comes the most powerful part. Jung also teaches us that integrating the shadow is an essential step for self-awareness. Recognizing what's hidden isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of courage. By shedding light on these hidden aspects, we not only regain control over ourselves, but also unlock a source of strength and authenticity. Imagine your shadow is like a wild beast. If you ignore it, it becomes dangerous, lurking in the shadows. But if you confront it with patience and honesty, you can tame it and discover that in fact it's a powerful ally. The shadow holds energy, creativity, and potential that can only be accessed when we stop running from it. So the next time something bothers you or leads you to act impulsively, ask yourself, could this be a part of my shadow trying to manifest? Having the courage to look inside and acknowledge these parts of ourselves is the first step to freeing ourselves from their control. And here's a thought. If denying the shadow makes us vulnerable to its control, what happens when we become what we fight the most? This is what Nietzsche warns us about. Let's dive into this paradox in the next section. Looking at the shadow is an act of courage, but also of prevention. Because the more we ignore or fight something within us, the more we allow it to grow and, unknowingly, end up living exactly the opposite of what we wish to be. Here we encounter a troubling paradox. By rejecting our negative traits, we can become what we detest the most. 3. The paradox of becoming what we most detest. Have you ever heard the phrase, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster"? Nietzsche's warning isn't just poetic. It describes a phenomenon that happens more often than we think. The more you fight a trait you reject in yourself or in others, the greater the risk of absorbing it, internalizing it, and making it part of who you are. But why does this happen? Let's go back to Freud and Jung's lessons. When we repress something, that something doesn't disappear. It hides, gains strength, and finds ways to manifest, even unconsciously. If you spend your life hating a trait like arrogance and devote all your energy to combating it, that hate can shape your actions so intensely that without realizing it, you might start acting exactly like what you condemn. This paradox is more common than it seems. Think of someone who spends their life criticizing others' hypocrisy, but in their obsession with pointing out others' mistakes, ends up acting just as hypocritically. Or someone who despises selfishness, but becomes selfish in trying to protect their own ideas of generosity. Hate, when mismanaged, turns into a distorted mirror in which we end up shaping ourselves. And here lies the greater danger. When we reject something so strongly, we don't give ourselves the chance to understand or transform it. Instead, we become prisoners of that feeling. Hate doesn't destroy what we reject. It only strengthens what we fight within ourselves. But there's a way out. Freud, Jung, and even Nietzsche show us that the secret lies in changing the focus. It's not about suppressing or ignoring, but about accepting and redirecting. When we recognize these parts of ourselves, we can begin to shape them consciously. We can use that energy to create something positive instead of letting it consume us. So, the next time you feel intense hate for something or someone, take a pause. Ask yourself, what does this say about me? Am I fighting so hard against this that I'm starting to become part of the problem? Acceptance isn't the same as giving in. It's about understanding, transforming, and growing. And speaking of growth, what happens when we define ourselves by what we reject instead of who we are? So far, we've seen how rejecting parts of ourselves can lead us to become what we fear the most. But what if I told you that even when we think we're in control, these ignored parts continue to exert influence over us? This is what Jung describes with a simple yet powerful truth. What we resist persists. Let's understand how this works. 4. The persistence of what we resist. Imagine trying to hold a ball underwater. At first, you can keep it hidden, but the more force you use to push it down, the more unstable it becomes. One wrong move, and the ball escapes, surfacing with all the accumulated force. Jung tells us that this is exactly how it works with the parts of ourselves that we resist facing. When we deny our shadows, the emotions, desires, and traits we prefer to ignore, we're not actually getting rid of them. We're just pushing them into the unconscious, where they continue to exist, grow, and gain strength. Eventually, they find a way to manifest, whether through impulsive actions, disproportionate reactions, or even destructive patterns that we repeat without realizing. Have you ever wondered why certain behaviors or thoughts seem to repeat in your life even when you try to avoid them at all costs? This is the persistence of the shadow. The more we resist, the more energy we give it. It's like trying to flee from something that's inside you. Impossible. Jung challenges us to change this dynamic. Instead of resisting, he invites us to confront. Because when we look our shadow in the face, we begin to understand its origin. And when we understand it, it loses the power to control us. Think about it. That anger that arises out of nowhere, the insecurity that paralyzes you, or the jealousy that seems irrational could be your shadow seeking attention. Not to destroy you, but to show you something that needs to be integrated. Recognizing these emotions isn't a sign of weakness. It's the first step toward freedom. So, the next time you feel yourself resisting something, take a pause. Ask yourself, What am I trying to avoid? What is this resistance trying to teach me? Because when we stop fighting against ourselves, we begin to use that energy to grow and transform. And this leads us to an even deeper point. When we fight against something, are we actually letting it shape who we are? If what we resist persists, what happens when we decide to fight against it? Nietzsche offers us a powerful warning. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. This phrase, as simple as it is provocative, invites us to reflect on how excessive focus on what we hate can transform us. Let's dive into this dangerous paradox. 5. Nietzsche and the danger of fighting monsters. Imagine someone who dedicates their life to fighting injustice. In the beginning, this person is driven by noble values, courage, ethics, the desire to do good. But along the way, they begin to act as relentlessly as what they are fighting against. Unbeknownst to them, they become part of the problem they swore to eradicate. It's about this silent transformation that Nietzsche warns us. When we fixate our attention on what we hate, we give it more space in our lives. We feed that energy, and over time it starts to shape us. The more we look at the monster outside, the more we ignore what's happening inside us. The result? We become a reflection of what we reject. For example, think of someone who deeply despises greed. This person might spend so much time pointing out and fighting others' greed that without realizing it, they start acting selfishly in their crusade to prove their point. Intense hatred turns the fight into an obsession, and the obsession ends up shaping who we are. Nietzsche wasn't saying that we shouldn't fight against what we believe is wrong, but that we need to be careful not to lose sight of who we are in the process. When you define yourself solely by opposing something, you risk disconnecting from the values that guided you in the beginning. So, how do we avoid falling into this trap? First, we need to remember that what we fight against shouldn't consume us. It's essential to have a higher purpose, something we fight for, not just something we fight against. Ask yourself, am I fighting for something or just against something? This difference is crucial. Second, it's important to keep vigil over ourselves. Observe your actions, reactions, and even the thoughts that arise while you confront your monsters. Are you still aligned with your values? Or are you starting to reproduce the behavior you so despise? Finally, Nietzsche invites us to keep sight of our humanity, because in the end, the real challenge isn't defeating the monster outside, but ensuring it doesn't find a place to grow within us. And this internal struggle is even more evident when we understand how our identities are formed in relation to what we hate. Hegel calls this negative recognition, and it's exactly what we're going to discuss in the next section. 7. Negative recognition in Hegel. What you love says a lot about who you are, but so does what you hate. Hegel introduces us to the concept of negative recognition to explain how we identify ourselves in relation to what we reject. In other words, when we hate something, it also begins to influence and even define who we are. Think of someone who builds their entire life in opposition to an idea or group. For example, a person who deeply rejects injustice may shape their identity as a fighter against injustice. But in this process, what they hate starts to become the center of their attention, and consequently, their existence. Instead of defining themselves by their own passions and values, they become defined by what they stand against. This negative recognition is dangerous because it traps us in a cycle. When we identify too much with what we reject, we lose the ability to see beyond it. We're no longer driven by who we want to be, but by who we don't want to be. This limits our choices, restricts our growth, and often keeps us stuck in destructive patterns. Now, think about your own life. Is there something you hate so intensely that you feel it shapes your choices, your thoughts, or even your attitudes? Ask yourself, if I stopped hating this, who would I be? The answer might reveal how much of yourself is connected to what you reject. But Hegel doesn't leave us with just the problem. He suggests that we can transform this negative recognition into something positive. Instead of defining ourselves against something, we can define ourselves in favor of something greater. It's like redirecting the focus. Instead of fueling hate, we nourish the values and goals we want to build. Recognizing the impact of hate on our identity is the first step to reclaiming our power of choice. Because, in the end, what defines us doesn't have to be what we reject, but what we seek. If hating something defines us, as Hegel suggests, it's natural to ask, where does this intense hate come from? Schopenhauer offers us a profound and uncomfortable answer. He relates hate to resentment, the heavy feeling that arises from unfulfilled or repressed desires. Let's understand how this works and why it can be so destructive. 8. Resentment. According to Schopenhauer, resentment is like an emotional wound that never heals. For Schopenhauer, it arises when something you deeply desire, be it recognition, love, success, or freedom, goes unfulfilled. Instead of dealing with this frustrated desire, we repress it, but it doesn't disappear. This repressed desire ferments within us, transforming into resentment. Now, imagine the impact of this on your life. The more time you spend repressing what you want, the more intensely this resentment grows. It begins to shape your thoughts, attitudes, and eventually your identity. For example, someone who always wanted to be recognized for their skills might, over time, develop a disdain for those who have achieved that recognition. This hatred isn't really about the other person. It's a reflection of the repressed desire. Resentment isn't just a negative emotion. It's a cycle. It makes us avoid confronting our desires, and this avoidance only increases their intensity. The more we feed it, the more it shapes us, corroding our view of the world and often of ourselves. But here's the key. Schopenhauer shows us that resentment doesn't have to be a destiny. It can be a sign, a call to look inward and recognize what we truly want, but are afraid or ashamed to admit. When we do this, we take the first step to breaking the cycle. Ask yourself, is there something I desire but am too afraid or ashamed to admit? Is this resentment I'm feeling linked to something I still need to confront? By asking these questions, you begin to transform resentment into self-awareness. Schopenhauer demonstrated how resentment is born from repressed desires. Nietzsche, in turn, deepens this idea, revealing the devastating impact it can have on our lives. According to him, resentment isn't just a negative emotion. It's a corrosive force that, if not addressed, transforms us into what we despise the most. Let's understand why this happens and how we can break this destructive cycle. 9. Resentment and self-destruction in Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, resentment is like poison, but unlike an external poison, it acts internally, corroding our very essence. It makes us fixate on what we hate, creating an obsession that slowly shapes our thoughts, actions, and even our identity. Think of someone who constantly feels wronged. This person might spend so much time reliving situations where they were harmed that they begin to build their life around this pain. They define themselves by what they've suffered and what they hate until, without realizing it, they start exhibiting the very behaviors they condemn in others. This is Nietzsche's warning. Resentment transforms us. It makes us relive the past, nurture grudges, and over time prevents us from seeing who we truly are or what we could become. And perhaps most dangerously, it traps us in a cycle of self-destruction, where we become prisoners of the emotions we most want to avoid. But Nietzsche also offers us a way out. He challenges us to leave resentment behind, to abandon this fixation on the past, and redirect our energy toward creating something new. He invites us to become the Übermensch, not in the sense of perfection, but as someone who transcends their limitations, who transforms pain into learning and hatred into creative power. Ask yourself, what is this resentment teaching me about myself? Am I using this energy to destroy myself or to transform? Because, in the end, resentment is a choice. And true strength lies in choosing not to be defined by what has hurt us, but by what we can build. If Nietzsche warns us about how resentment can imprison us, Viktor Frankl offers us a key to liberation. He believes that the secret to overcoming hate and resentment lies in something profound and transformative, the search for meaning. When we find purpose in our lives, even the most negative emotions lose their power to dominate us. Let's understand how this works. 10. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and the founder of logotherapy, had a clear message. The greatest strength of the human being lies in the ability to find meaning, even in the most difficult circumstances. For him, meaning is like an internal compass that guides us toward a greater purpose, capable of transcending pain, hatred, and chaos. Now, think about the impact of hate in your life. When you intensely focus on what you despise, your energy, attention, and even your actions become shaped by it. Hate creates an obsession that diverts your focus from what truly matters, living a purposeful life. It's like trying to walk forward while constantly looking back. Frankl warns us that when we let hate dominate, we risk losing sight of what gives our lives meaning. It's not that hate doesn't have a role, it is often a legitimate reaction to pain and injustice. But if we allow ourselves to be consumed by it, we end up disconnecting from what we truly want to build. Logotherapy invites us to make a shift in perspective. Instead of fixating on what we hate, Frankl suggests we ask ourselves, what purpose do I want to pursue? How can I use this experience to become a better person or contribute to something greater? He reminds us that we cannot always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react. And that choice makes all the difference. Because when we choose to seek meaning, we create space for healing, growth, and transformation. Think about it. What could you create in your life if you redirected the energy of hate toward purpose? What would you set aside to pursue what truly matters? This search for meaning is a powerful invitation to break free from the cycle of hate and live more intentionally. And when we learn to focus on what builds rather than what destroys, we move closer to a more fulfilling life. Frankl showed us that finding meaning is essential to overcoming hate and transforming our perspective. But in practice, how can we do this? How can we redirect this negative energy and use it to build something positive? Let's explore practical strategies that can help us prevent hate from consuming us and live with more purpose and balance. 11. Strategies to avoid hate. Dealing with hate isn't about repressing it or pretending it doesn't exist. On the contrary, the first step to preventing it from controlling us is to acknowledge it. Jung teaches us that when we confront our shadows, the parts of ourselves we prefer to ignore, they lose the power to dominate us. Here are some practices that can help. 1. Recognize the shadow with honesty. Take a pause and reflect on what's behind the hate you feel. Ask yourself, is this feeling related to something within me? Self-reflection can reveal insecurities or repressed desires that need to be understood. Recognizing isn't the same as accepting these emotions as definitive. It's the first step to transforming them. 2. Focus on what you love, not what you hate. Hate consumes, but love builds. Instead of spending your energy fighting what you reject, redirect your focus to what truly matters. What are your values? What do you want to cultivate in your life? Asking yourself these questions can help create a more positive and constructive direction. 3. transform hate into constructive action. If something deeply bothers you, channel that feeling into making a difference. Hate can be transformed into energy for action, as long as your actions are guided by purpose, not resentment. For example, instead of just criticizing what's wrong, ask yourself, what can I do to improve this situation? 4. Find meaning in your emotions. As Frankl teaches us, seeking meaning is essential. Instead of fighting against hate, try to understand it. What is it teaching you about who you are or what you need to change? This approach turns negative emotions into opportunities for self-awareness. 5. Practice gratitude and forgiveness. Hate ties us to the past, but gratitude and forgiveness set us free. It's not about ignoring injustices or pretending they don't hurt, but about choosing to move forward. Ask yourself, what can I be grateful for today? What can I forgive to free myself? 6. Take care of yourself. Finally, remember that dealing with intense emotions requires self-care. Find ways to care for your mental and emotional health, whether through meditation, talking with trusted people, or seeking professional support. These strategies aren't quick fixes, but daily practices that over time can transform how you perceive and handle your emotions. Remember, hate doesn't have to define who you are. You have the power to choose what to cultivate in your life. As Jung said, no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And now that you're aware of this process, the final question is, what energy do you want to nurture in your life?